super good to see you. And as we like to say, good to be seen by you. And of course, good to be heard by you, those who are listening on the podcast version of the podcast. Of course, that's the primary place where I guess you should be listening. We're very glad you're around. On Fridays, we do talk about science. And today, we're talking about the kind of science that influences how the economy works. The science of economics is what we're going to be getting after today. So we're very glad that you're here. I am standing at my studio desk today in Minneapolis, and love to know where you are, what it is that you're doing. Let us know in the comments. And those of you that are just listening on the podcast and can't let us know in the comments, just take a moment and let that question, where are you, settle in as sort of a philosophical reflection. I am now here, or I am nowhere. And do whatever you want with those fun little word phrases. Take a minute and consider where you are, what you're doing in the world, how you interact. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about economics, and Robb Ryerse has joined us today because he has a friend. And this friend is an economist, and his friend knows about modern monetary theory. Now, you may not know about modern monetary theory, and you might be like a lot of us that say, frankly, I don't even know how the economy works. Like, how is there enough money for everybody, and where does it go, and why does this become so important in all the debates that we have about who we are as a country and how we're going to live? Well, we're going to try to get to the bottom of some of that, and so in a bit, we're going to be joined by a scientist who studies economic theory. So that's what we're going to be getting after today, and that's where I am. Our podcast is all about taking this positive, hope-filled, open-eyed journey to engage big questions of what's going on in our world and what can we do in light of it. And that's what we want to engage with you about. So thanks for being with us. Robb, good to see you on a Friday, 2 times in a week. Robb is typically our politics guest on Politics Tuesday, but nice to see you today.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I'm not used to getting up this early on a Friday, right? No, I'm joking. It's
10 a.m. Boy, it really stretches you.
Yeah, it's right. I know. I'm normally the Tuesday politics guy, but when we talk about economics, so much of politics and economics are intertwined. These things go hand in hand, and frankly, like, we try to bring a little elucidation to the folks about how politics works on Tuesday. My hope is that we can bring a little elucidation about how economics works, and debunking some of the ideas that are just really, really common in our kind of modern our cultural psyche, and a part of our political landscape, with just ideas that are just told over and over and over again like fact that might not actually be true. And I'm excited about Fadhel being able to share with us today about some of that stuff.
Well, it's always good to have friends that are brilliant scientists. And I just want to note that John Francis from the UK is joining us, and he says, I'm now in London trying to work out on a sermon for Sunday. So, John, really good to have you around on here. Hey, Robb, you might not know, if we were just with our sky scientist, who's our astrophysicist, Paul Wallace, who's with us every other Friday for our science conversation, we would be talking about the fact that today is the Lunar New Year. So happy Lunar New Year.
Thank you.
And I didn't know this, but 1.5 billion people roughly celebrate today the way a lot of us celebrate what we would refer to as the holiday season. In the cultures that we live in, you get the period from Thanksgiving to Christmas and maybe New Year's as sort of your holiday season. Well, there's a whole lot of people in many Asian countries, especially China and Korea and Vietnam, where they put their focus, in addition to any of those, would be on what's going on with the moon. And that, we mark a year. This is what I learned because I looked at an Oprah magazine article today. But we count a year by the Earth going around the sun. The other is to take the orbit of the moon, and after it goes around 12 times, it starts over. So that becomes the Lunar New Year. So this kind of observational narrative of our society, of our world that we live in, this is what science wants to do, is pay attention to what's happening in the world around us, and then to make predictions and to make comments and to make suggestions about how we could live in light of those things. Could we utilize that? Should we be concerned about it? So this is what science does. And that's why talking about economics, when we get to this here, and when Fadhel gets here, pronounce his
Fadhel.
name for? Fadhel. Thank you.
Fadhel.
When Fadhel gets here with us, he's going to be well versed in all of this. That I think a lot of us are trying to figure out. Like, okay, obviously, the economy is a thing, right? We know that. We know that the economy happens because there's money in our bank account, and somehow, we have businesses and we open stores. But that's sort of the observation. Then there's people who say, in light of that reality, what's going on? What's happening? And they start making predictions. And those predictions then become part of framing, as you put it so well, a narrative that people have about the world. So the reason we're talking about economics is because it actually really does impact people's lives. And the decisions that get made in our country about how we spend our own money. Like there's sort of personal finance, and then there's like organizational finance, and then there's this bigger question of government finances, and all of that is part of the economy. So it really is a powerful force in our society. And I think we will hear this from the Economist today. There's just a lot of theories about how all this works. Like none of it's proven. There's people that have a point to make, and they are suggesting that if we behave differently in light of these facts that happen in the world, then we would, we'd get some kind of a different outcome.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I like the fact that you bring up this idea that things are theories, and Fadhel's going to talk about what's called modern monetary theory. I like using that word because what it does is it forces us to hold these ideas lightly. And I think there's probably a lot of folks that think that economics is a settled thing. And, the version that they were taught, growing up, is the way it is. And I think there are certain kind of beliefs and perspectives that people have about economics, and particularly the American economy, that are so very settled they've never even thought to consider that you could look at it another way. And Doug, both you and I, come from the religious world, where when people begin to hold theories as dogmas, things get dangerous. And I think there's probably a lot of theories that people hold as dogmas when it comes to economics, simply because they've never been exposed to another way of thinking about it. There's a certain amount of to bridge the gap with the sciences. There's a certain amount of like the earth is flat until somebody says, no, actually it's round. Right. And they're like, wait a minute, what? No realization of what could actually be.
The economic theory that Fadhel is well known for, and other people are as well, it's not his theory alone, is a theory that's referred to as heterodoxical. It's a great word. In the world that we work in religion, you just call that heresy because it's not orthodoxy. And this idea that it's a heterodoxical monetary theory that other people attack, meaning that there's some set of orthodoxy about what we all agree on is true, and then someone has a view that's outside of that orthodoxy, and they give that a name. And then if you were to Google, and we hope that you will if you're watching the live stream here, or if you are listening on the podcast, you can look in the show notes. There's some links to the modern monetary theory, and it lists all the other theories of the economy that are heterodoxical, that don't match the orthodoxy and get put in that pattern. And this is where economics and other versions of science, the social sciences and the hard sciences, and other areas like religion and art, or I would even go so far as to be very bold and to cross this Rubicon, sports and athletics, they all have an orthodoxy, right? They have a set of standard known beliefs, understandings, and then they have people who say, no, I think we could do it a little differently. And here's the funny thing. In science, and this is what Paul Wallace, who's the astrophysicist and co-host of Every Other Friday's daily podcast on Vote Common Good, says is, Yeah, no, science really likes the unorthodox view, right? That's what you're always pushing for. Most all beliefs in your scientific understanding today were at one time seen as something that it was totally outside of the orthodoxy. So rather than being, and this is what people like you and I and many others have been trying to say inside of our religious traditions, is rather than being terrified by the lack of orthodoxy that you see in a new idea, maybe investigate it to see if it's pulling out something that the orthodoxy has hidden away, that the orthodoxy has prevented you from getting to. And so you're always balancing in science, and you're balancing in every other area of life. When do you just stay with the tried and true? And when do you break into some new territory and some new way of engaging and some new way of thinking? And that's not always clear, right? You don't want to just run around and have totally bizarre, obscure ways of living, or you end up being, like the insurrectionists and the Trump supporters and many modern day supporters of that hard-edged, radical religious right movement. That's outside the bounds.
Yeah, what we're talking about is not conspiracy theories about sciences, about the economy. What we're talking about is an observation of the facts and interpreting them in a different way. And and it's not the type of thing that I really I want to caution people not to think that this is like some wacko conspiracy theory approach that Doug and I are about to launch our own version of Q or something. Like this is not it's not that. This is a challenge to the orthodoxy from a very fact-based perspective.
That's well put. That the difference between sort of a radical fringy view is what it does with shared information, and how that information, that data, gets categorized into something we would call a fact, and then how those facts get categorized into a belief pattern. That actually the way we put that, where a set of facts that sort of become dangerous or conspiracy theories are different than what we're talking about, is that it can be a rejection of information that we know needs to be included. So, right, when you find yourself, if ever, in any theory, and this would be personal development theory, this would be religion, science, if you run into information that you say, I don't have a place for that can't fit in my worldview, that can't fit in my information set, I can't take that information into my fact set. If you can't do that, then you're inside of a space that is really dangerous. So, in fact, this kind of, heresy to the orthodoxy or heterodoxical view of economic theory, it's actually trying to, and this is what scientists tell us all the time, prevent that very kind of thing that we refer to as a conspiracy theory, right? It wants to make sure the system stays open enough. And we've talked, previously in the weeks here about the power of conspiracy theories and how they function and how they work in the world. And we need to be careful of them, because when someone is following a way of thinking that has to prevent other information from coming in. Now, here's where that gets scary, though, Rob, tell you the truth. That's what a lot of the people who believe in conspiracy theories tell the rest of us. Like, you're just not listening. You're not looking. You're not seeing, right? And so while that's a nice philosophical idea that I've just laid out there, it doesn't really get us far enough down the road. So, hey, you and I are chit-chatting here about this, setting the context, because our professor friend, Fadhel, is going to be
teaching a class.
Fadhel is teaching a class and is going to be joining us here when he has a chance to get logged on. So that's what we're up to, and that's what we're doing. Hey, I've noticed that Jara in the comments on Facebook says, I know nothing about how economics works. This is interesting. So that's where I think a lot of people are. They don't know, and so when a professional, whether it's Janet Yellen or Greenspan or a elected representative tells you about how the economy works, and if you're like a lot of us, we have no idea, how it works and couldn't really describe it. It's easy to just take that as a fact and not even know that inside of economic theory, people are having discussions about how it works.
Yeah. And I think, I want to say something about that. Vanessa and I have lived in our home for 12 years now. It's the longest I've ever lived in one place. And we are now at the point where there's a lot of things around our house that we've got to fix. And we're right now in the process of putting in new floors in our upstairs bedrooms, in the kids' bedrooms. And one of the things that we've realized over the years is that as we've lived in this house, is that there's lots of things that we don't understand how to do them. Like there's repairs that need to be done that we don't know how to do. But we often will say to each other, well, somebody figured this out. We could figure it out. Mm-hmm. And we watch some YouTube videos and we go talk to, and some folks at Lowe's or Home Depot about it. And we Google and we chat with friends and we figure it out. And I keep using the word we when really I mean Vanessa, because this is totally this is her department of our lives. She's the one who kind of leads all of this stuff in our house. And, but you have this sense of like, okay, we can figure this out. Right. We have participated in this. It's a little bit like, can you explain how your microwave works? I'm not sure. Excuse me.
Oh, bless you,
I'm
by
not
the
sure
way.
You can. Yeah, thank you. I hit the mute button there before I sneezed.
Well played.
There's so many things in life where, you can't explain, like you take advantage of it, you participate in it, even though you can't explain it. But when you can explain it, when you do understand how it works, there's a depth of knowledge that is just real in confidence that is just really, really important in life. And so I think there's probably some reality, when we think about economics that, everybody participates in our economic system. I don't know how many of us feel confident that we could explain how it works or that we could fix it if we needed to. And that's why, we've got Fadhel with us today, who's hopefully going to, share some light on all of this.
Well, Professor, glad to have you with us. Thank you. Rob and I have been lamenting here about the fact that we don't know a lot about economics. We think a lot of other people don't. People in the comments on the live stream are already saying that they agree with that. And then we're talking about how there's sort of orthodoxy and heterodoxical views of these things and framing this larger conversation. So we're glad you're here to help us and to save us from ourselves. Thanks. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, and thank you guys for having this podcast program. I think it's important for the public in general to unpack a lot of the things that we're dealing with economically, politically, socially, outside of the mainstream kind of corporate media network box. I think this is very healthy for a democracy.
So we on this podcast, each day we have a different theme to it, and Friday is our science day. So we're glad to have you on here. And I do think about economics as one of the sciences, right? It's part of the way that we understand the world that we live in. Can you give people who don't really know what economic theory is and what economists like you do, can you just talk a bit about sort of how all that works and what the economy is about and how it gets put together for an economist?
Absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, economics is the study of the economy. So what is the economy? At a fundamental level, it's about the way in which we as a society organize ourselves in order to provide for the material well-being, to provide for the basics, food, shelter, transportation, entertainment, to improve our quality of life, health and all of that. So that's the fundamental role of the economics profession, is to study the ways in which we can actually do this and do it better, do it faster, healthier, cleaner, fairer over time. And that's where you start getting different schools of thoughts and different political ideologies involved in terms of defining what's the best way to organize society. And broadly speaking, there's like two umbrella kind of schools of thought. One that says the free market does it best. If we as a society, fundamentally rely on the core pillars of capitalism, of the market system, which is, competition, freedom of choice, self-interest, and private property, right? That's what Milton Friedman told us. Then we individuals competing freely and fairly using our own private property, including intellectual property, competing for what's best for us in a selfish way, not only will we achieve what's best for us individually, but we'll deliver what's best for society as a whole. So that's the free market approach to economics. That was the dominant view up until the Great Depression, when it was clearly the case that the market system, collapsed, that we had freedom of choice and all of the pillars of capitalism were their private property, and we went into a deep depression. In the US, it was 10 years of Great Depression, poverty, misery, hunger, you name it. In Europe, it was 20 years of Great Depression. People were born and raised in misery during the Great Depression. And that led many to believe that approach to managing the economy was just a failure, right? And it was a British economist who was actually part of the free market tradition, John Maynard Keynes, who rebelled against the discipline of economics and said, well, wait a minute, we don't have to sacrifice private property or competition or freedom, including political freedom and democracy. He said, as a matter of fact, in order to protect democracy and freedom, we need the visible hand of the government, not the invisible hand of the market. So government intervention, not control, not ownership, not communal property. And that was his genius. And that's why today, for example, when we're dealing with this global pandemic economic crisis, the dominant perspective is that we do need government intervention, right? Even people who believe in free markets and all of that stuff. I mean, you've seen Republican, conservative, say, yes, this is the time for government intervention. That's what we learned from Keynes. Prior to Keynes, 20 years of Great Depression in Europe, and the entire profession was convinced that, the market will eventually get us out of this. Just don't do anything about it. And Keynes was like, you can't convince me that 25% of the labor force decided to go on vacation because it's their freedom during the Great Depression. They're unemployed. It's not their free choice. The system is collapsing. So we've learned something. And since then, it's been this back and forth between leaning more on government intervention to boost economic prosperity and lack of government intervention, leaning more on free markets and that cutthroat competition type of idea. That's where we are. That's where we've been for the last 100 years, back and forth between these two approaches.
And I don't know this very well, but it seems like what I hear in the public spaces is that the free market people will say, look, the free market really, really works unless something goes wrong. And then we need a little intervention. And then we can get back to the free market working. Am I being too flippant about what they say, or is that pretty much it?
That's a good assessment of the dominant perspective, right? That is absolutely true. So those same voices today that say we need government intervention, in about a year and a half, 2 years, they're going to flip and say, well, we're done with government intervention. The market will pick it up from here, right? Which means we as a society, from my perspective, so you can define me as somebody who's coming more from a Keynesian perspective, will never get to that full employment and highest quality of life and highest potential that I think we can afford and we deserve because of that idea that we just do it to save the system from completely, collapsing, but then we'll go back to, business as usual, which means we'll be fully satisfied with 5% unemployment or 4.5 or whatever they say that's reasonable, which means we're fully satisfied with millions of people officially unemployed, millions more living in poverty. We say that's the best we can do. That's what the market will deliver. And that's where the MMT perspective comes in, that says we can actually afford to do much, much better without sacrificing democracy, without causing inflation, without bankrupting the country. And that's I think that's why you asked me to comment
Yeah.
today.
Please, keep going. I
Yeah,
love this.
yeah. So Fadhel, tell us about MMT, about modern monetary theory. That might be a phrase maybe that people have heard or maybe not heard. What is it basically? Kind of give folks who are listening an understanding of MMT.
Sure. So first, the label MMT, the theory part, modern monetary theory. It's a misnomer that none of us in the academic circles have invented for ourselves. It was some blogger who created the hashtag MMT and it went viral. So now we're stuck with it. But the best way to think of it is a study of modern monetary systems. And the phrase modern monetary systems or modern money is not a new concept that we invented. It was actually Keynes in the 1920s and 30s who wrote about modern monetary systems, like how the capitalist monetary system operates. And he said it sarcastically. He said, by modern money, I mean the last 3,000 years. This is how monetary systems operate at a fundamental level. So it started as a joke, and then some blogger made the hashtag MMT, so now we're stuck with it. So the best way to approach this is to think about MMT as an analytical lens, as a way of looking at how the monetary system that we have in the US today and other parts of the world functions. Who creates money? What does it mean for the government to spend more, spend less, tax the population? What's the meaning of the national debt? And the following observations immediately emerge if you take this approach. Number one is recognizing that the government is the issuer of the currency, the federal government, not state and local municipal, right? So the first distinction is that there's two categories here. There's some of us who are users of the dollar. That's you and I. That's your city council. That's your local state, businesses, households, consumers. We're all users of the dollar. We don't get to create it. It's illegal. You go to prison for a long time. You do it if you counterfeit. The only entity that can the only entity that can do this, the entity that has the power of the purse, is the U.S. federal government, right? And then the U.S. federal government delegates that exclusive privilege to some licensed entities. We call them private banks. They're giving a license to create money via the fact that they issue credit. They lend money. They have a banking license. They're regulated as such. So they don't print money, but they create money through the process of lending. And we can go into that. But fundamentally, that right is exclusive to the federal government and its agents, these agencies that have the right to kind of outsource that capacity. Because we don't want the federal government to micromanage every car loan in the country, right? So we outsource that money creation process to private entities under certain rules and regulations. And those initial rules and regulations, which most of us have forgotten by now, and MMT reminds us of, those rules and regulations actually resonate quite a bit with the name of this podcast, which is the public purpose and the common good, right? The power of money creation was delegated to banks in order to fund the construction of housing and infrastructure and sewer systems and railroads and so on. But by the time we get to today, we've lost sight of that relationship, of that legal privilege that was given to banks. And now we've allowed banks to rule the world and govern the system and influence the political system and tell us what we can afford and what we can't afford as the people, right? So that's a first observation. The second observation is that from an MMT perspective, the spending capacity of the federal government, the mainstream of the profession tells us is limited. We're constrained in terms of what we can do. We're limited by how much we can collect in tax revenues and how much we can borrow from private lenders like bond markets or banks or financial institutions. MMT says, wait a minute, we're not limited by tax revenues and spending capacity and borrowing capacity like states and municipalities. Those are limited, right? You and I are limited in terms of how much we can spend. You and I have to earn an income first, then spend it. And if we wanted to spend beyond our income, you and I have to go into debt. We have to borrow from a bank, credit card company, a friend. And that borrowing is not unlimited. At some point, the credit card company will cut you off. The bank will cut you off. So we're constrained. That's the way it works, which means we have to work harder, earn higher income, live within our means. All of that, fiscal responsibility stuff applies to you, me, municipalities, businesses, and so on. The federal government has a much, much larger spending capacity. It's not unlimited. And I always say it twice. It's not unlimited. It's constrained, and it's limited by the risk of inflation. In other words, what determines the risk of inflation? Because that's going to tell us how much spending capacity we can afford to have better health, better education, better everything. That risk of inflation, according to MMT, is determined by two fundamental things that are very intuitive for most people to understand. The first one is the availability of productive capacity. In other words, if we have skilled workers who are unemployed, if we have raw materials, technology, productive capacity to produce more, if we spend in that area, it will not cause inflation. But if we run out of productive capacity, if we run out of doctors and nurses and hospital beds, and we want to spend more on healthcare, we're going to cause inflation. I'll give you an easy example. Let's say, tomorrow we declare that, dental hygiene, dental care is a human right, and every person in this country deserves it, and the federal government is going to pay for it.
Amen.
And President Biden declares, pick up the phone, call your dentist, and schedule an appointment. It's a human right. So I pick up the phone, call the dentist, say, yeah, we're happy to take you. The next available appointment is 2033. When would you like to come? And then they say, well, if you really need to come in next Wednesday, we're happy to take you. We have this golden premium membership that costs $10,000 a month. We're happy to take you next Wednesday. So we haven't really done anything to change the system. We just made it impossible and more exclusive and more expensive, because that's going to cause inflation. Why? Because we don't have enough doctors and nurses and hygienists and so on. So the productive capacity is really key in preventing inflation. The good news about productive capacity is that it's producible. We can train more nurses, more doctors. We can build more hospitals. And that creates millions of jobs and improves our quality of life. So that's the easy part of the inflation constraint. The second one is challenging, and I think the second one will be more interesting to your audience in particular. It has to do with abusive market power. When you have key corporations who can raise prices because they can, right? Think of health insurance companies, Wall Street, big oil, big tech. You can't really, internet companies. I don't know where you live, but where I live, they raise the price every other month, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no alternative, right? They divided the country. So that's what I'm talking about. The abusive price setting behavior of key corporations. That kind of inflation, you can't really get rid of it by spending more or spending less. You only get rid of that abusive pricing behavior and inflation risk by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence, which means you make those markets more competitive, more democratic, which means whose job is that? It's the 535 people we send to Washington, D.C. Their job is to tax and regulate and make the market fair and competitive for us. But here's the problem. If the 535 people we're talking about are mostly funded by super PAC money from those companies, then we're in trouble. Then we don't have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We have a government of the super PACs, for the super PACs, by the super PACs. And to finish this idea, that's the market power that suffocates our spending capacity and denies us healthcare, education, you name it, all the other things that we deserve and we can afford.
Yeah, Fadhel singing my song there at the end. That's fantastic. So a couple of follow-up questions I want to ask you. Maybe someone's thinking, okay, so and here's the heresy that Doug and I were talking about earlier. So you're suggesting that the purpose of taxes is not to fund programs and to fund initiatives by the government, but the purpose of taxes is to provide some kind of regulation?
Right. So that's the third observation that comes from an MMT perspective. Go ahead. I didn't want.
Well, I was going to say, I just want to pause for a second on that question, because Rob, it feels like you know that question well. You've thought about it before. Professor, you've obviously thought about it before. I've never thought about that before, so I'm guessing some listeners haven't. Rob, I think it's worth just sharpening it, just saying it again to sharpen it in people's mind, to make this contrast from what we hear all the time.
Yeah.
There is a common refrain that we hear from politicians and people that are running for office. They talk about taxes as revenue, and we raise taxes, we collect taxes so that we can fund, and we being the federal government raises taxes, collects taxes so that programs, initiatives, investments, whatever term they use, entitlement programs, can be funded. And you're suggesting, Fadhel, that that's not the way things are actually funded. And there's a different purpose for why we collect taxes.
Absolutely.
Blow my mind. Hit us.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, all of us, when we discovered this was like the world is upside down, right? But, it's a tough pill to swallow.
The earth is not flat.
The earth is not flat. By the way, if people are interested in this, the best book to read, which is still on the New York Times bestselling list, is Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. Highly recommended, very accessible book. So here's the idea. You and I, states and municipalities, operate under a different framework than the federal government. So your local state or city council, local authorities, they have to raise tax revenues in order to build a new school, in order to build a new sewer system. We either tax the residents of the state, or we borrow from bond markets, with the understanding that we'll be levying a tax over the next 20 years to pay for it, right? That's the only way states and municipalities function. That's the only way I can build my own house, right? I borrow money from a bank, I pay for it for the next 30 years. If I wanted to buy a car, same thing. That's how we operate. Unless you're a billionaire, then you have plenty of cash to pay for it. But most of us, when we deal with big expenses, big investments, we have to borrow and then work hard to pay it off over the next 20, 30 years. The federal government doesn't operate that way because it's the issue of the currency. I mean, if I issued my own currency, why would I need to borrow money from you, right? But then the question becomes then, number one, why does the federal government borrow to begin with, if what I'm saying is correct? And why does the government need to tax us in order to spend? So taxes and what we call borrowing at the federal level plays a completely different role than taxes and borrowing at the state and local level. And I'll give you a few examples just to illustrate that the government actually doesn't need taxes to fund programs, but we do need to tax for other purposes. So what MMT says, we need to tax, Wall Street, not because we need their money or their permission to fund education, but we need to tax them to reduce inequality. We need to tax them to reduce their power and influence in politics. We need to tax them to reduce financial speculation and financial instability. That's a very important role for taxation, but it's not because we need their money or their permission to fund schools. We need to tax.
Let me interrupt for a second. How does taxing do those things? How does it slow down or restrain? Sure. Why does a federal tax do that?
Sure. So taxes and regulation, I should say, right? So think of it in terms of, we say we want to fund green infrastructure to deal with climate change. And some people say, oh, we need to tax oil companies because we need that money to pay for the green transition. MMT says, well, we decouple these two things. Tax in order to decarbonize the economy, to reduce their power and influence in politics, to reduce pollution, right, for our own sake, but not because we need their money or their permission to invest in green technology. We can do these things separately, but we've been used to this idea that we need to link one to the other because we're used to doing this at the local level. We need to tax this particular company in order to fund this particular program or this particular industry in order to do that. Same thing with all of this. I'll give you two examples. One is recent and one is from 100 years ago almost. How did we pay for World War II? The most expensive government program in the history of this country. World War II came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in U.S. history. There was no money to be taxed. There was no money to be borrowed at that time. And yet we went into this massive spending program to win World War II. I mean, can you imagine if Congress at the time said, we can't afford this big war. What we can do is maybe send 10,000 troops every other month and see if we can scare them. That's not how you win World War II, right? We went to this massive program. No taxing took place before the war. No borrowing took place before the war. The taxing and borrowing happened during and after the war. Way after the war was in motion, it was paid for already. The question for economists and for the government at the time was, how do we make sure that those workers that we paid good wages to produce all the war equipment, how do we make sure that when they go home and they decide to spend it on buying new cars, new homes, new clothes, whatever, it's a free country, they can spend it whatever way they want. How do we make sure that that new wave of spending is not going to cause inflation, right? Because that was the problem. The problem wasn't really creating the money. The problem was, how do we make sure the risk of inflation doesn't materialize? Well, guess what? That risk of inflation was real because we didn't have any productive capacity left during the wartime to produce new cars or new homes. Literally, we didn't have any during the war period because we literally had all the workers focus on, we turned the entire city of Detroit upside down to produce for military equipment. So the challenge was, how do we convince those good citizens not to go out on a shopping spree and cause inflation? Well, one of the things was to sell them freedom bonds, war bonds, leverage the patriotic mood of the nation and say, how about you abstain from consumption until after the war? And we, the federal government, promised to pay you back plus interest. And that was the case after the war, when we actually had productive capacity for homes and cars and entertainment and all of that. That's where the spending spree happened. So the war bonds were not sold to finance the war. The war was already paid for. The war bonds were there to deal with the risk of inflation, right? Same thing, the taxation that happened was there to deal with the risk of inflation. We of course had to go to other extremes because World War II was extreme. We had to control some prices in key areas. We have to, ration our use of strategic commodities. That was necessary. Of course, we don't have to do that today. We're not in that kind of situation. The second example to illustrate that the federal government can spend way beyond what we would consider tax revenues and borrowing is what happened during the pandemic with the CARES Act. Yeah. And what's happening right now with the new spending. Do you hear anybody, or did you hear anybody during the debates about the CARES Act about who are we going to tax or who are you going to borrow from to save the economy from total collapse, to save our lives, essentially, during the pandemic? Not a single discussion about this. Literally 535 people met on the Hill and voted unanimously. I mean, there were a few people missing because they were exposed to COVID and couldn't vote, but literally unanimous vote. So what MMT tells us, when we talk about national priorities, when we set the priorities straight, it's not about finding the money, it's about finding the votes and then managing the risk of inflation in a way that I described. Do we have the productive capacity? Because the question during the pandemic wasn't about finding the money. We found the money, we found the votes. The question then became, do we have the masks? Do we have the doctors? Do we have the vaccines? Do we have the PPE equipment? That was the crisis. It wasn't finding the money. But during normal times, we shift the focus completely on, we don't have the money. Where are we going to find it? When we have idle resources, unemployed, skilled people, motivated people, physical equipment, technology sitting idle, and we're sitting on our hands and saying, we don't have money to make anything happen, right? So that's the MMT insight observation that I hope millions of people are increasingly discovering now, that there is money, that the focus should be on the real resources that we're either not using or mismanaging or not producing enough of, and on the market power that dominates how we make those decisions. When we had 535 people vote for the CARES Act, They didn't, check with their corporate sponsors whether they should do it. They did it because that's what the country wanted. That's what the democratic process would dictate. But then when we shift away from pandemic mode, they check with their bosses first. and that's the problem with democracy fundamentally.
Like literally, is this the kind of thing that people who are in Congress, senators, congresspeople, treasury secretaries, do they know this? Or are they, when you share this with them, are they like us, or me at least, where my head is like, okay, hang on a minute. I didn't know or think that the federal government's role of taxing was different than state and municipal taxing. So that's a mind changer. And that the federal government uses taxes for social effect, not for revenue generation. Do they know that and aren't telling us, or is it actually that you talk to your senator, you talk to your congressperson, and they believe like we do that there's some bank account that money has to go into through the IRS, and then you decide you have enough money to pay for it? Because they're always asking the question, well, how are we going to pay for it? And it's like, well, transfer it from this account to that account, like my wife and I trying to decide to go on vacation. Do they know this and are just not telling us, or do they not know this?
Very good question. So some of them do know and act accordingly without saying it. Some do know, but also completely understand the political power shift implications that this entails, and as a result deny it and try to fight it. And some, to be honest, just don't get it. They think that the government is literally like a business, like a household. You hear people saying, we've maxed out the credit card. Uncle Sam is broke. We borrowed so much from China. Those phrases. So I can't assess kind of the degree of honesty and knowledge about this. But what I can tell you is this, and I'm new in this generation. Some of my teachers, early thinkers in the MMT space, for the last 20, 25 years, they've met with senators and congressmen, introducing these ideas. And this is what the reaction was and still is to some extent. Behind closed doors, after 1 hour of this conversation, they get it. But then they say, wait a minute, I can't go out in public and say this. People think I'm crazy. I'm going to bankrupt the country. So then they say, get me a critical mass of constituents, people, media commentators who actually understand this and who will actually back me up when I make these statements, at which point I'll come out and say it. And my joke at the time was, if I have that critical mass, I'll vote you out of office and have a better person.
Yeah.
But who would you get? So that's curious. But who would you get? Like, are there people? Because I just feel like, I don't know, who really knows this
Believe
stuff?
it or not, it's both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats.
Yes.
There are people on both sides who get it, who understand it.
Yeah.
But then here's what happened in the last 20 years, especially the last 5 years, since Bernie, since AOC, since Cori Bush, since Jamal Bowman. These are individuals who were, didn't have any political capital to waste, so to speak, decades worth of being part of the establishment or super PAC money or anything like that. And finally discovered a framework that ends this idea of austerity, that we can't afford all of these things because we'll go bankrupt. So if you're a progressive candidate and you really want to tackle climate change and health and education, you naturally come up with these very bold, ambitious, expensive programs. Then they ask you, how are you going to pay for it? Who are you going to tax? Who are you going to borrow from? And if you don't have the MMT answer, you're eventually going to be cornered back into fiscally conservative, smaller programs, which is what we have, right? That kind of fluctuates a little bit. So what we've had over the last few years with these candidates, with MMT economists becoming a bit more prominent, like Stephanie Kelton was Bernie Sanders' chief economist in the Senate in 2015, his chief economist during the campaign in 2016 and the 2020 campaign, and quite a bit of the financial media paying attention to MMT because of the observations and statements made by mainstream economists against MMT were proven to be wrong. So somebody like Larry Summers keeps saying MMT is voodoo economics, doesn't make any sense. And the financial press says, yes, Mr. Secretary, we get it that you don't like this approach. You think it's crazy, but you haven't told us why. And you haven't really convinced us that you have a better answer that explains why all of your predictions for the last 20 years have been flat wrong. Wrong about inflation, wrong about interest rates, wrong about the deficit, wrong about all of these things. So in the meanwhile, Mr. Secretary, we're going to keep listening to these MMT economists because sure, they have crazy new ideas that we don't fully understand, but they're certainly making more and more sense. So the burden of proof is now on the mainstream that has admitted they have no reliable theory about inflation, about the deficit, about any of this stuff. So gradually we're gaining more prominence to the point that 5 US senators last year brought a resolution to the floor to condemn MMT as dangerous for the country. Because if we follow MMT ideas, we're going to have hyperinflation and all the stuff that mainstream economics claims, and
so
we've proven to be wrong. Yeah.
Let me just jump in for a second. With kind of the answering the question of like, do our leaders in DC know about this? Two stories. One is it was, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago or so. I was sitting in Washington D.C. at an event where Fadhel was presenting ideas and principles of MMT to candidates for Congress, helping them to be able to answer the question, how do we pay for it when it comes to Medicare for all or the Green New Deal or those kinds of things, answering that question, how do we pay for it? And I was sitting next to Jamal Bowman, who is now a congressman from New York City. And Jamal kept turning to me and saying, this is so awesome. This is so awesome. About 10 times during Fadhel's presentation, Jamal would just turn to me and say, this is so awesome. So we've got leaders, and Cori Bush was in the room that day as well. We've got leaders who know about this, and there's leaders, as Fadhel just mentioned, on the other side who know about this. I think the most recent mention of MMT in Congress was by Doug's favorite senator, Rand Paul, who was railing against MMT.
He's not. I just need to be on the record here. I need to be on the record. That is mean-spirited sarcasm. That is all that is.
Is MMT being kind of the polar opposite of libertarianism and bothering him so much. So I think my guess is the vast majority of Congress doesn't know, but they act like their rhetoric and their actions don't match, and we can see that with the stimulus packages that have taken place. There's rhetoric about how are we going to pay for it and all of that sitting down at the kitchen table with your checkbook and trying to balance it. But then when we're in a crisis, their actions betray that the reality that that's not actually how things work. Right. And then you've got those kind of on the edges who understand this, those who are in favor of it, and those who are like Rand Paul who are trying to resist it.
So be gentle with me here. Pretend I don't get this. I haven't thought about this as long as the two of you have. I'm having a hard time separating out which things this is. Obviously, there are proposals that go along with the modern monetary theory, MMT, that people don't like. So is that this, or are you saying, is the idea that the federal government's role in taxation is not to take in revenue to have it in a bank account to spend, and it's rather to influence the conditions of behavior? Is that what you're saying? People like, does everyone agree that that's the role of taxation? Like, people on all sides do all economists agree that that's the function of taxation? So if Janet Yellen was listening to this, and former Treasury secretaries from all sides, would they all say like, well, yeah, we all, of course, that's true. What the Professor Fadhel said about how why we tax and what the function of federal taxes is, yes, that's true. In light of that, here's how we should behave. Or do they say, that's not why we tax, that's not how we tax, and I wouldn't explain it that way? Can you just help me get over that one?
Sure.
I mean, maybe I'm the only one stuck on that, but I think that would help my clarification.
That's a very good question. So the majority of economists and the mainstream would say the primary purpose of taxation is to raise revenues for the government. And you can use taxation to incentivize, tax cuts to encourage certain things and heavier taxes to discourage certain, behavior and approaches. MMT says, there's no such thing as taxing for revenue at the federal level. It's only to achieve those goals, social and regulatory goals. There's a famous piece by a former head of the Federal Reserve Bank from 100 years ago, who essentially said the title of the piece is "Taxation for Revenues is Obsolete." He said, "We don't live in a gold standard universe where money is scarce and we need to go out and collect it in order to spend." So when you push mainstream economists on this, they say, well, of course we know the government can spend beyond, but that's a dangerous thing to do. We don't know why. We don't have an exact theory, but we know it can cause inflation, so we're not going to do it. But MMT has a much more precise way of saying, let's assess the limit to how much we can spend safely before we get to the inflation cycle. And that gives us massive amount of spending capacity that can transform our quality of life, improve our quality of life. Doug, to go back to your earlier question, which you started your comment with, there's this idea that some people say, well, MMT, is it an observation of how the system works? Yeah. Or is it a set of policies to tell us what to do? So let me be clear. MMT starts with those key observations about how we spend and the purpose of this, that, and the other. But then the policy prescriptions that I would derive from MMT, somebody who believes in the democratic process and believes in justice and so on, would be very different than what Dick Cheney would derive from MMT, because Dick Cheney also understands MMT, for different purposes. And I get this from quite a few friends on the political left of the left end of the political spectrum. They say, well, you guys shouldn't be giving them ideas, because if you tell them they can spend more, they're going to go out and invade every other country, and they're going to go out and give more tax cuts to their friends. Yeah. So let's pretend like we don't have money and force them into being fiscally conservative so they don't go do all of these bad things. And that's just, not right, right? If we live in a democracy, we shouldn't be tricking each other into good behavior. We should be open and honest about this. So sometimes I joke, and I really insist it's a joke, and I love all Canadian people. Sometimes I joke, I say, you know what? We can actually afford Medicare for all, and if we wanted to invade Canada, we can afford it too. But it doesn't mean we should.
It doesn't mean we should.
Right? We have, if we wanted to set the priorities straight, whatever those democratic priorities are, invade a country, healthcare, education, whatever those democratic priorities are, we can achieve them. We can put our minds to it. I mean, that's how we put a man on the moon. That's how we won World War II, because we set the priorities and we dedicated the brain power, the resources, and we said, we're going to do this, right? Except when it comes to using the MMT observations, under normal circumstances, we get the priorities mixed up. The priorities is power and influence and super PACs and their interest. Those are the spending priorities, tax cuts, military spending, this, that, and the other. And then when it comes down to the next set of priorities, social services, healthcare, education, we ran out of money. Too bad. I mean,
I hear a lot of people on the left say this, frankly, and I've said it too. Like, we gave tax cuts, a $1.9 trillion tax cut in 2017, and that took money away from the government to spend on better things. You're telling me that's not true.
It didn't take away any. The proof is we had money to deal with the pandemic, despite
which is also $1.9 trillion.
I'm not for the tax cut for the oligarchs. I'm against it. But that's not a valid argument to say, well, that money was gone, so now, the purse is empty and we got no money to spend, which is what a lot of people are saying, by the way, today. They're saying, if this new bill passes for the pandemic relief and all of that, how are we going to deal with the next crisis? We're out of money, right? And we say that with every crisis, we're going to be out of money. We've spent it all. So that's a very dangerous, approach. I mean, literally dangerous for our lives, right? And thank God we have some common sense outside of the economics profession that says, spend. You've probably heard the governor from West Virginia, with his beautiful expression says, "This is not the time to count the cows," or whatever the expression was.
Yeah, don't count the legs, count the cows. Okay, so here's the other phrase that comes up all the time, and maybe you're going to say, move to Denison College and enroll in my economics major. I hear the phrase all the time, deficit spending. You've talked about inflation, which is on one side. The other side is deficits. I feel like I'm about to leave this and write some Facebook post where it says the government can spend as much as it wants, knock this stuff off, which I've sort of always believed, but didn't really know why. I thought I was just being foolish. Is deficit spending, should that be a phrase and something we worry about? And can talk me down from the belief that I'm forming right now that it's unlimited, because you started this whole thing by saying, I'm not saying it's unlimited, but I've listened now for this period of time and I'm saying, oh, he's saying it's unlimited. So it was a good correction and I clearly can't help myself from saying it. Sure. But is deficit spending a thing and is it unlimited?
So imagine, Doug, you have access to the largest lake of fresh water on the planet. It's right there in your backyard. Does that mean you should drink all of it? You drink whatever you can handle. You use whatever you can use for, watering your farm or whatever. So, conceptually, it's unlimited, right, for your uses, but it doesn't mean you should consume all of it. Similarly, you can think of the federal government having unlimited capacity to issue its own currency. Nobody says you can't, but it doesn't mean you should. So what limits how much you should use of that capacity is the productive capacity of the economy to handle the additional demand for goods and services that will come from that new spending. If we can't keep up with the spending, it will cause inflation, which means in your example, if you can't, literally absorb, more water, you'll hurt yourself, right? And you'll flood your farm, right, with too much water. So you use whatever is needed to keep the system flowing nicely, smoothly, so that your plants are not starving, so that your farm is not flooded, right? Just enough to keep things going at the right pace. Just enough so that you're not dehydrated, so that you're not also blowing up your stomach with excess water. So that's really the right metaphor for it. It's there. It's not limited, but we should use it wisely on our priorities. And what we're doing right now, we're artificially suffocating our people, starving them, suffocating the economy, because we believe that we have no money to spend, right? And because of this myth of the deficit. And to answer your second question about the deficit, deficit spending, my favorite way of articulating this to the average person, and this is stuff for the average Joe, right? Pun intended here, for the average person. When we say the government deficit is too high, it's unaffordable, what I say is, let's focus on the deficits that matter. Because the federal government deficit is not like my deficit with the bank. That's a serious financial burden. The federal government can't run out of its own money, right? Here are the deficits that matter. It's the deficit of infrastructure, deficits of health, deficits in education, deficits in PPE equipment, deficits in vaccines and vaccine delivery today. These are the deficits that matter. In terms of the debt, it's the debt, the climate debt, the reparations debt, the social justice debt. Those are the debts that matter. It's corporate debt, it's household debt. These are the real burdens. But the federal government debt is not the same thing as my debt, because the government can't run out of its own money, right? We can always manage the national debt as long as we serve the economy and deliver the things that we need. And then finally, on the deficit thing here, if you think of it this way, people say all of these progressive programs are too expensive, right? What I say is the cost of doing nothing is too expensive. The cost of doing the right thing is actually the cheap version.
Right.
Think about the social costs, the hidden costs that we are paying for already. The cost of the opioid crisis, which is estimated at $2.3 trillion right now. Hidden cost. Nobody talks about it. The cost of all the social problems associated with unemployment, anxiety, depression, suicide, family breakdown, domestic violence. Tons of studies around the world showing that every time we have higher levels of unemployment, all of these social problems increase and their cost increases. Incarceration, policing, all of this stuff currently is many, many times more expensive than the cost of doing the right thing, which is investing in people, investing in communities, investing in education. Very simple common sense that most of us have, including fiscally conservative people. I say this all the time to fiscally conservative friends and audiences. I tell them, here's the deal. Would you rather spend a little bit of money up front with after-school programs and summer camps to inspire kids with music and theater and sports and set them off for, a better future, or not do that because we think it's too expensive and then end up building the prisons and spending on the opioid crisis, spending on all of these negative things that are many, many times more expensive? Wouldn't we rather have clean water, air, and soil, or not do that because it's expensive and then pay for everybody's cancer treatment in the city, right? Which one is cheaper? Which one is healthier? Which one is better? Of course, this is the fiscally conservative approach, is to say, well, this is the cheaper, better version. But we have to shift the narrative about the things that matter. And I think this is what we're trying to do with this work within the MMT community, within Rob knows that I work with quite a few candidates who have all the right, kind of progressive democratic ideas. They don't take money from super PACs. They don't take money from big oil and all of that. But they want all of these progressive things. But if they don't have the answer, right, how do we pay for it, or we can't afford it, then we're stuck. We're back to square one. And I think with this narrative, we can convince our friends and neighbors and fellow citizens that the current system is too expensive. We're actually providing the better, cheaper, healthier option, and we can afford it without bankrupting the country, without becoming a communist society. This is our democratic system. This is not going to turn into a communist system.
Well, I would certainly love to have you back on and to talk about this more. So let's talk about that. Can I just ask you, and I know we've taken a lot of your time, so I'm sheepish about this. When you said the phrase, the government basically doesn't pay for its debt the way that you and I do. What I hear politicians say is we're passing this debt along to our children. So they say, not only like, well, we're not going to pay for it, but somebody has to pay for it, and it's going to be future generations. And so they invoke children and say, basically, you're bankrupting the next generation and your children. Any quick comments on that, if you have time for it?
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite questions, because I should start collecting these things. Every election cycle, you probably get these in the mail. You get these little postcards from like your local, congressional, senatorial candidates with pictures of babies or young children crying, and a big red number that says, I already have $50,000 in debt and I was just born last week. That's the debt burden on future generations. Yeah. That's a very powerful message that lots of politicians use, that narrative that we're borrowing today, and that borrowing ultimately has to be paid for with higher taxes on future generations. It's unfair. It's a form of taxation without representation. It's a burden on future generations, and so on. Well, they're using the metaphor of a household, a family. If I borrow $100,000 and my children have to pay for my debt after I die or whatever, then that's unfair. That's a burden that they have to suffer during their generation and not start their business or whatever, because we're not able to create money. We have to earn it somehow. The federal government, as I explained in the case of World War II, as I explained in the case of the pandemic and so on, the national debt, that big number of the national debt, the 20-some trillion dollars, is literally the summation of all the previous deficits since the beginning of the Republic, minus the few surpluses that we had in U.S. history. It's mostly deficits. So what does that mean? It means it's the annual deficit. It's how much the government spent in the year 2020, for example, relative to how much we collected in taxes. We always spend more than when we tax, typically. The money that we spent into the system is still in circulation. The money that we tax is money taken out. So the deficit, the annual federal government deficit, is literally, to the penny, the equivalent of the money that we put into the economy that we haven't taxed yet. So where is that money? It's in circulation in the US economy. Some of it is outside in the global economy because we're the largest economy in the world. We dominate the world and so on. So naturally, some of it is in other countries. But it's literally the equivalent of net savings, net wealth in the non-government sector. So if we want to eliminate the national debt, if we want to eliminate the deficit, we're literally saying we want to eliminate a portion of the private sector wealth that's been accumulated. Now, we can do that if we want to address inequality, for example. We reduce some of that excessive accumulation of wealth in the top 1%. So we can tax for that purpose, right? And that's what MMT would suggest. But it doesn't mean we should tax all of it out and leave the system dry, right? So very different than your state deficit. Your state is a user of the US dollar. So when my state borrows to build infrastructure, to build hospitals or whatever, it needs to pay for it in the next 20, 30 years with taxes and levies on school districts and so on in order to pay for that investment. Because the state of Ohio didn't create those dollars. The state of Ohio borrowed them from somewhere and needs to give them back plus interest, right? Very different than you and I, right? You and I don't have this privilege of spending beyond our capacity. So the fact that the national debt is increasing over time is natural. It's part of the system. It's not a burden on anybody. So when those government bonds come due after 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30 years, that's how the Treasury issues bonds. When they come due, the holders of those bonds go to the Treasury and get their principal and interest payment guaranteed. The federal government can't run out of money to pay to meet its commitments. But what the federal government needs to worry about is the risk of inflation, not the risk of not having money to pay interest on the debt or to pay the principal. We know we always can. Remember that big lake you have in your backyard? You have plenty of water. What you need to worry about, does your farm actually produce enough food to sustain your family and your community? That's what matters. Not, am I saving enough water for, to pay interest or whatever?
Oh my gosh. Okay. You have to just reassure me that I'm not falling into some QAnon-like cult of
No,
misinformation and some sleight of hand wackoness.
I actually
the
think
idea
this is,
that deficits.
I'm not actually joking. I think this is actually one of the ways we deal with the QAnon, rabbit holes, because we've abused people, we've ignored people and their pains and anxieties, and drove them into despair. And that's just fertile ground for all kinds of things. So I take this very seriously, and I think that the political establishment that we have today, they're not taking it as seriously as they should. They think it's a problem of communication. They blame people for being stupid, ignorant, uneducated. They keep insulting people and their beliefs, which convinces people further that all the conspiracies that they believe in are actually valid. And I think that's the most dangerous thing that we've done over the last few years, just ignoring this, especially in this part of the country, in Appalachia and the Midwest and rural areas. It's not a problem of communication. It's not a problem of education. There's some of it. It's not a problem of racism. There's some of it, of course. I'm not going to deny that. But fundamentally, this is a problem of the political establishment depriving millions of people of better quality of life and forcing them into despair, forcing them into blaming the other, blaming people outside of this border, blaming China, blaming Mexicans, immigrants, this, that, and the other. And of course, somebody like Trump shows up and tells them, yeah, I'm going to fix it for you. I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to stop the Chinese. I'm going to stop the Mexicans. And that just sets people on fire and drives them into all of these rabbit holes that we need to get 70 some million people out of those rabbit holes. That's a big challenge.
It is. Well, I would love to have you back on. I have so many questions about this, Rob. Maybe you do too, about sort of where this can go and how it can go. There's just so much. So thank you so kindly
Thank you
for this.
for the opportunity.
Really, really great to have you on. And please accept our invitation to come on again.
Happy to do it. Thank you again for the opportunity and for everything you're doing on this show.
You bet. Thanks, man.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. Well, Rob, that was spectacular. My mind is
Fadhel's
blown.
fantastic.
I mean, the idea that deficits is the money that's not yet taxed. Hold your proverbial, and perhaps, I don't know where you're listening to this, literal horse. That is not how anybody I've ever heard describe a deficit, that it's the money that yet has not come into the purview of the government to yet be taxed. Holy moly.
Yeah.
All right.
Good stuff.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed. I think we've had a fabulous 2 weeks of the Vote Common Good podcast. We've had a lot going on. Be sure you subscribe over at votecommongood.com/podcast or wherever you get podcasts. Do subscribe too, even if you're watching this on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you seem to be watching this. We'd love to have you subscribe to the podcast. And if you're only listening to the podcast and you use any of those other social networks, please go over and follow us there, especially over on YouTube, where we're delivering all this. On as we like to remind you all, on Mondays, we talk about common good news, and on Tuesdays it's politics. The very Robb Ryerse that you've seen today is part of that. We talk common good faith with Laura Truax and Stephanie Spalding and Dominique Gilliard and myself. On Thursdays, we talk about issues. Yesterday, we talked about abortion. We're going to do it again the following week. Can we find a common good way to deal with abortion? And you know that we're talking science, all matter of science on these days, on Fridays. So I am energized, confused, and so encouraged by just a unbelievable. This is why, okay, we're going to stop because we're now at an hour and 18 minutes or something on this podcast. But I think this is why people don't understand economics, because what they've been told and what's actually happening are so different that it's really hard to understand. Like sometimes you don't understand things because you just don't have the base knowledge. And sometimes you don't understand things because you know things that just ain't so. This old Mark Twain quote that says, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." And this is one of those moments for me. It's not what I didn't know. It's what I thought was the case, and turns out that it's not. And that sort of opens up what these whole new vistas to us all. Any final words, Robb Ryerse?
No, I encourage folks to check out Fadhel, Google him, and read his articles, listen to podcasts. There's a lot to learn.
Yeah. Hey, good day today. Hey, good day to all of you. Thanks for being around. Share the good news, and we'll be back and see you on Monday here on the podcast.